In this talk I want to continue on the foundations of what I call the structuralist period, that is from about 1890 for the next 100 years or so, and look at some of the implications of it, this new paradigm, particularly for anthropology and other social sciences. Some results of this shift from an interest in history, progress, origins, as in evolutionism, towards how things function, how they're interrelated, what structures them, what is the substructure, etc., can be seen in both history, anthropology, and other disciplines. It's a period when there is a concentration. What is important now is depth, not width, boring down, getting to the deep structures, so to speak. This is manifested in various subfields or disciplines like anthropology and sociology, and it requires the development of new methods of intensive observation. You're not prepared for or as interested in wide sweeps of customs and history, but in the micro detail of life in different societies and different places throughout the globe. A new precision of detail, a new measuring of reality, and of how little bits are connected to each other. This is the great area of new methodologies in the social sciences, when each discipline in search of accurate, non-evaluative data, no morals, just looking at the data itself. And each discipline developed its special research methodologies, whether psychology, history, anthropology, sociology. Before, the data for the social sciences, particularly anthropology, had come from non-professionals, from people who had gone out for other purposes, missionaries, traders, explorers, and so on, and they brought back tales of what they'd found and artifacts, and this had been fitted into a large evolutionary scheme. Now the academics themselves went out. I mean, symbolically, for me in Cambridge, it's the first Torres Strait expedition of Haddon, and then particularly the second Torres Straits expedition, 1898, when a conscious effort was made to go and find detailed evidence. They took a camera, one of the first times a camera was taken to the field. Some of the film still remains. That's a film camera, and also take some kind of wax cylinder recordings, photography, measurements, and some of the important members of that team, like W.H. Rivers, was a scientist, and the natives were to be precisely measured, investigated. It was a shortish expedition, and later, instead of a whole group of people going for a shortish period with all their paraphernalia, developed into the intensive participant observation methods, which I myself practiced over the years in the Himalayas, of going, learning the language, and trying to get inside the culture. It was the professionalization, really. You had departments being set up. Early departments of anthropology originated around this time, and sociology, and so it becomes a professional academic discipline based on new methodology. Likewise in history, my other discipline, because this is the period of the professionalization of history departments, of professors of history, and of an attention to detail and the microscopic. The academics were not so interested in wide sweeps. Rather than they were interested in either going to a particular society and learning as much as possible all about that particular society, or if they were historians, in going to a particular period in history, often much shorter periods. The broad sweeps of Victorian history, taking like Stubbs and Freeman and others, the whole sweep of British history from the Anglo-Saxons up to the present, was now set aside largely as a project, continued with some people on the edge like Trevelyan's Social History of England and so on. But now you became a specialist. An anthropologist would be a specialist in a particular island, a particular tribe, a particular part of the world, and a historian would be a specialist in the 15th century or 14th century or whichever century or two, and within that century some particular aspect of it, political life or economic life in the 14th century, whatever it was. And so the map of history and cultures was now being filled in with the detail. And this was current and happened not merely across the disciplines in psychology and elsewhere, but also across different countries who were developing the disciplines in the West. For example, a huge impetus was given to history by the Annales school, as they were called from their journal Annales, in France. And here you took a particular period, a particular institution, perhaps one of the most famous and the one that I've found very influential on my own work is the work of Marc Bloch, one of the founders of the Annales school. And in his study of feudalism, he took a particular institution over a few centuries and examined it in a functionalist, structuralist sort of way. Or Lefebvre, another founder of the school, studied mentality in the 16th, 17th centuries. And so you find, instead of the great sweeps of Lecky and others I mentioned, you have Michelet and Guizot and the earlier French historians. You have a concentration on shorter periods and delimited subjects. This meant a change in the role of academics to a certain extent as well. In the Victorian period, the great academics like Sir Henry Maine and others had been, and Stubbs and others, had really been quite involved in the larger imperial project. Maine had been an advisor to the Indian government, etc. Now historians and anthropologists retreated more into universities and into documenting other societies and other times from a more purely academic point of view. In both disciplines, therefore, there was both a widening of interest in the subjects to be studied, but a narrowing of the time band or the space band of the investigation. We might know less and less about why things changed, but we certainly began to know more and more about things at a certain point in time or a certain place on the globe. You became a real specialist. I was taught history at Oxford, and by that, the time I was there in the middle of the century, you might have a medieval specialist like my namesake, K.B. Macfarlane, who was really a great expert on the 15th century, and in particular on Wycliffe and on the politics of the 14th, 15th century. And you got your respect from that. This, as I've mentioned, required new methodologies. Going back yourself, this was the difference. Before you relied to a certain extent on others, certainly in anthropology on the missionaries and travellers, and to a certain extent on secondary sources as a historian. Now it was the raw data you wanted. Maitland was a great figure in this, in editing medieval records and starting record societies, and you went back. You weren't happy with the conventional wisdom. Check it for yourself. Go out to the Trobriand Islands, go back to the 14th century and have a look at the original material and try and work out a new framework, or work within the new framework, to to establish what really happened and what people all around the world are really like. And of course this leads to all sorts of surprises. You find, for instance, that the whole stereotype of ignorant and stupid savages and so on doesn't stand up for a moment once you actually go and spend a year or two with them and find out that they're much cleverer than you are in many ways, and certainly are not children in any sense. So it's an era of positivism, that is, let's look at the facts and then suspend our judgments, induction from those facts upwards. What is important is the particular. The extreme, as it developed in the middle of the century in England, was local history. You would just take one village or one manor and write about its history. And one of the great founders of local history in England was W.G. Hoskins, one of my teachers, and one of his favourite quotes was from William Blake, one of his aphorisms. To generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize is the alone distinction of merit. The tiny micro worlds was what academics were really interested in. Maybe later you could synthesize these. For instance, Freeman in his advocacy for an anthropology of China in the 1960s suggested that once we had lots of detailed community studies of different villages in China, we might be able to build up a picture of China as a whole. But let's first get the pieces of the jigsaw and then fit them together. This reaction against evolutionism in anthropology was to be seen in the work of all the great generation of anthropologists who worked across Europe and America. It can be seen in what Clifford Geertz would later call thick description. That means very intense description in the work of Margaret Mead, which drew parallels between Samoan and New Guinea societies and treated them as equal. The great thing about Margaret Mead and others of her time, Louis and others before, was that they weren't making moral judgments. Mead really appreciated and loved the people she worked with, as did Gregory Bateson, one of her husbands, and Rio Fortune, another, and so on and so on. They admired and found fascinating the worlds which they were privileged to enter. They were equal in many ways and had lessons even to teach us. That was a new shock, that the hitherto rather demeaned savages actually could teach us how to live. Margaret Mead's fame largely, a lot of it rested in the public sphere, and the fact that she thought that the child-rearing, puberty and sexual customs of people in Oceania could actually teach a lesson to the Americans. And the same was true of Malinowski, who also studied sexual life and other things and thought that what we learn about how Trobrianders and others organize their lives will actually help us to understand our own sexual and other customs. So learn about their internal patterns and then see if there is a lesson from the deeper humanity you discover there for our own civilization. As I've constantly mentioned, Malinowski was a pioneer of this methodology, partly accidentally and alongside a number of others, and it's described by one of his main pupils, a direct pupil of his, Edmund Leach at Cambridge. He writes in a lecture on Fraser and Malinowski, the professional reputation was directly tied in with the unique quality of his field research, which had been of a quite unprecedented intensity. I'm not quite sure whether it was so unprecedented. Boas was fairly intensive and so on, and Rivers to a certain extent, but they were Malinowski was an intensive field worker. No professional anthropologist had ever spent 2 full years studying a single tribal group, actually living in a native village and sharing the native way of life. That may be true. The need to get back to the original text, this is me, to see the natives' viewpoint, unbefuddled by the prejudices of others, to let people speak for themselves, was what was required. It led to far more accuracy. The whole change really is caught in a rather unkind contrast when Sir James Fraser reputedly, was asked on high table at Trinity by his friends whether he'd based his huge work on the Golden Bough on actual observation. They put it in the phrase, Sir James, have you ever met a native? Now, of course, to meet a native was slightly out of bounds in such a situation, and Sir James is reputedly, after meditation, answered, perhaps not after meditation, God forbid. Anyway, he may not have done so. On the other hand, Malinowski's rallying cry was something to the effect of, let's see the native world through the natives' eyes. The new manifesto, or the new approach, was part of a much wider movement, and Malinowski's great contemporary was Radcliffe Brown, who actually had done a study before Malinowski of an intensive kind of the Andaman Islanders. And in his preface to the Andaman Islanders, he describes his method, which takes the discussion on a little bit, because it's not really intensive. It's to try and see the culture through the context of the events one is witnessing and through the eyes of the people themselves. He says in the preface, ethnological field workers have often been content to record myths and describe ceremonies without concerning themselves with the meanings, with what these things express. There's a danger that the ethnologist may interpret the beliefs of a native people not by a reference to their mental life, but by reference to his own. It therefore seemed to me necessary for ethnology to provide itself with a method of determining meanings as effective and free from personal equation, that's in inverted commas, as the methods by which a linguist determines the meanings of words or morphemes in a newly studied language. One explicit example, which is to be found in a letter which he wrote to others who were doing the same thing, Spencer and Gillan, in Australia, and in a letter to them in the Balfour Library of the Pitt Rivers Museum, Radcliffe Brown writes, I feel sure that the accounts which we have of Bayema and Darumulum, I apologize for the pronunciation, are very misleading. The accounts that we have of them are very misleading, and that quite innocently the white man has read into the ideas of the native his own ideas in regard to a deity, from the idea that there could not be a race of people who had no idea of a supreme being. In other words, missionaries and others who'd been to this area had assumed they must have an idea of a deity and read it into. And he was writing to these two important field-working anthropologists, encouraging them to look at this again and seeing whether, in fact, this was the case. The general emphasis on precision, on detail, on context, on suspension of judgment about the morality of the situation extends through all the disciplines. I mentioned history and anthropology, but it was also true of archaeology. In archaeology, there was a growing emphasis on precision of recording the cultures that, or the artifacts that were being dug up. This was the great era of accurate recording and of new standards of fieldwork precision. In his overview of the history of archaeology, Lynn Daniel sees the last quarter of the 19th century and the early 20th century as the period of great discoveries and innovations, like Schliemann, Petrie and Pitt-Rivers, who people were now measuring very, very carefully. A long amount of time was spent on a particular archaeological site, and the excavations were being better funded. So Pitt-Rivers and was to archaeology what Boas was to anthropology, and their disciples were like Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. For example, Glyn Daniel describes how in the 1920s the great excavations at made by Leonard Woolley were using intensive methods similar to those in history with documents and anthropology with participant observation. And the archaeologists were also shifting. They weren't content merely to try and reconstruct in their minds what past civilizations were like. They really wanted to try and find out what the meaning of these objects were to the people themselves, the context of their survival, and how they had been used. The same was true, this same shift was true in sociology. Just as historians developed a method to get back to the historical facts, archaeologists to the archaeological facts, and anthropologists to the ethnographical facts, let's have facts, so did sociologists. One major example of this lies in the work and influence of, some ways, a refounder, at least, of sociology and a great prophet for the discipline, Emil Durkheim, especially in it's shown in his work on suicide, which was based on detailed statistical work on the incidence of suicide, showing when it occurred, who was involved, and so on. And from these facts, inducing theories, sociological laws. The only one, having read it, I don't remember many of them, but one of them was the odd fact that many studies showed that incidence of suicide was very high, in some societies at least, in April. April, as the poet was later to say, is the cruelest month. That's T.S. Eliot, but he wasn't thinking of this, but it is a difficult month, or it was before global warming, and which has shifted it earlier. And so April was a high time for suicides, and one needs to speculate about this. Likewise, you find it in Max Weber's concern with the meaning and the objectivity of the social sciences, a new concern with methodology. And it was the time of the growth in sociology of intensive studies of particular groups and particular problems, similar in a way to anthropology, using similar methods of participant observation to a certain extent, but usually in the sociological case done in industrial Western urban societies. So the general mapping of the 19th and 18th centuries of stages of civilization was giving place to filling in the tiny bits of the jigsaw. And in sociology too, there was an anti-evolutionism. The evolutionism of the early phase of sociology, Kant, Marx and others, gave way to this anti-evolutionist stand in the later part of, towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Evolutionism didn't go away. It's always simple to think that when one paradigm goes, you immediately get another one. It's usually a matter of a large flow, a large stream, and then tributaries or substreams within it. And so most thinkers have a bit of all the different paradigms within their thinking. For instance, Max Weber was, to a certain extent, an evolutionist. He wrote a lot about the movement from feudalism to capitalism and the development of societies. But one difference he had, apart from concentrating more on the function and the interrelations, was that he was a pessimist rather than the kind of optimist of the 19th century evolutionists. He was particularly pessimistic later in his life. Again, the effects of what happened in Europe in the early 20th century, the rise of Germany and then the destruction or the defeat of Germany, and the rise of what Weber thought was a new kind of coldness, the effects of science and particularly bureaucracy, would lead to a world that wasn't necessarily better than the world it replaced. And in his famous essay, Politics as a Vocation, he wrote, "Not summer's bloom lies ahead of us, but rather a polar night of icy darkness and hardness. When this night shall have slowly receded, who of those for whom spring apparently has bloomed so luxuriously will be alive?" Pretty gloomy stuff. He talked about the iron cage of rationality. We become more rational, maybe, but we lose so much by becoming rational. It is an iron cage that imprisons us, as bureaucracy does. He became conservative and pessimist. As Nesbitt puts it, as we cannot fail to detect in Tocqueville a strong preference for aristocracy, and in Tönnies a ruling affection for Gemeinschaft. That was the older system of community. In other words, they weren't optimistic entirely. Neither can we fail to detect in Weber throughout his life and work a haunted preoccupation with the traditional values that were being jettisoned, as it seemed, by the rulers of the new society. And to continue with Nesbitt, to seek the causes of the change of a social system, capitalism, not in itself, which was what so many others had done under the spell of the ideas of continuity, but rather in a separate system, in other words in religion, in Protestantism, was itself a noteworthy accomplishment, given the universality of evolutionary and endogenous theories of change in Weber's day. To insist further that if change in society is to be brought down from the level of panoramic generality, the great sweeps, this too was a major contribution. And finally, to put the entire matter of the study of the rise of capitalism in a genuinely comparative context was unique in that day of still commanding unilinear developmentalism. With the comparative method, most commonly understood to be simply a means of illustrating stages of evolutionism in a single progress, as with Marx and Spencer, but Weber was a real comparatist, comparative thinker, and looked to see what was unique about particular situations by looking at China and India and the Middle East, all over the world. The other founding father, supposedly Durkheim, was both also an evolutionist and an anti-evolutionist. Though he's often classed as an evolutionist, at least in theory he revolted against the idea of unilinear evolution. And this is a point made by Robert Lowy. So his writings are structural. Durkheim is definitely in the tradition of structural thinking, which goes right back to Montesquieu and before, looking at a particular point in time. Although, for instance, you might think that his work on religion, which was looking at very, very simple forms of religion, the elementary forms as he called it, was then going to lead on through the elementary forms to the complex forms of Western society. He never actually did it. The elementary form stands alone, and he doesn't take it through the less elementary forms up to the modern. So there's a kind of residual evolutionary idea in Durkheim, in that he's looking at the elementary forms, the most simple as he saw it in the Australian Aborigines. But he's like, to a certain extent, like Margaret Mead and others, in that he's looking at it for a lesson for us. Durkheim's great problem, of course, was what was going to replace religion and the family systems in holding together Western societies. And he thought, well, let's see what religion does in the simplest societies, and maybe we will then see what it could do for us. So the idea was that by looking at the way religion brings together people and gives their lives meaning in very simple societies, we could perhaps go back to something like that or learn from that. But he was in many ways a pessimist and never took it any further. So let's now turn to the next matter, which is what are the reasons for this great structural transformation to structuralism. In a strange sort of way, as often happens, the new theoretical systems act with the data both to justify the collecting of the data, and then the collection of the data changes the theoretical system. And a very good example of that is the great American anthropologist Franz Boas's work among the Eskimo, as they were called then, in the 1880s. Boas's ideas show the way in which, by micro studies, by detailed studies, the whole more general evolutionary paradigm begins to be challenged. His work had been stimulated for 10 years when in 1896 he urged a renunciation of the barren comparative method. That was another way of describing the evolutionary method, and its vain endeavour to construct a uniform systematic history of the evolution of culture. This is Boas himself writing. To correct evolutionary fallacies, Boas substituted the historical method of controlled investigation of the dynamics of culture growth, very careful, precise investigations of one or two cases. From the outset, he worked incredibly hard and systematically to destroy evolutionary anthropology. And it was partly through his own field experiences among the Eskimo in 1883 to 4, and later among the northwest coast Indians, that he came to these new ideas. The same had happened for Radcliffe Brown in the Andaman Islands right at the beginning of the 20th. The Haddon expeditions, which I've mentioned, in the 1890s, Malinowski, and so on. So there was new data. It was often put in a rather crude way, but the movement from what was known as armchair anthropology, in other words, sitting, as Fraser, Tyler, and others tended to do, in their armchairs in nice rooms in the West, and speculating about how the natives lived on the basis, admittedly, of a lot of information sent to them, or they'd read huge libraries. Fraser had a fantastic library and had read a huge amount, but in the end he was sitting in his armchair thinking about, if I was a native, what would I make of this, or why would I be doing this? Instead, he went out. It was put to me in the middle of the 20th century in terms of local history as getting your boots muddy. This was the cry of the local historians like W.G. Hoskins, and he was influenced by people like R.H. Tawney. Go out and get your boots muddy, find out the facts on the ground rather than speculating from secondary information. So evolutionism began to lose its favoured position in the 1890s, according to Vogt, owing to new biological and historical cultural evidence that cast doubt on the linkage to racial theories and to long-term evolutionary changes of the old kind. Finally, the anomalies piled up. As Kuhn, who I talked about earlier, said that paradigms change when there are just too many anomalies. You can fit in a few and quite a lot, but when they come pouring in, and this had overthrown the linear theory of the world, then had led to the progressivist view of the world and the evolutionary view, and now there were too many anomalies. As Lord Avebury put it, if the system of relationship lies subject to gradual growth and approach step by step towards perfection, we should naturally expect that from differences of habits and customs, the various advances would not, among all races, follow one another in precisely the same order. The Burmese and the Japanese, which, though on the whole considerably more advanced in civilization than any of the foregoing races, yet appear to be singly backward in their systems of family naming. Now that was an anomaly, but he didn't allow it to break up his system. Another anomaly was increasingly China. Again, Chambers had noticed this much earlier on. The problem of Chinese civilization, such as it is, so puzzling when we consider that they are only, as will be presently seen, the child race of mankind, is solved when we look to a geographical position producing fixity of residents and density of populations. But now, instead of brushing them aside, they become a source of ridicule. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but certainly you could brush aside, to a large extent, anomalies for a long time. But increasingly it was impossible, and you had to change the theories to fit the facts. The difficulty of doing this was great, but it was also difficult to do anything else, because the study of social change was that the evidence was so thin, and therefore you needed to try a new approach. The new thinkers, like as I've mentioned with Durkheim and Weber, they weren't entirely anti-evolutionary. It's too simple. There was a neo-evolutionism within them as well. For example, Radcliffe Brown, according to Lowy, one aspect of Radcliffe Brown's historical thinking, which was lightly sketched rather than fully sketched, is his notion of cultural evolution. It differs from Morgan's scheme in renouncing a universally valid sequence, but it does imply definite social trends, notably the tendency of wider integrations to supersede those of narrower scope. This neo-evolutionary phase of Radcliffe Brown's philosophy of culture suggests ideas broached by Thornwald and Schmidt. These were famous German anthropologists. And even Malinowski himself had some hints in his thinking. For example, in his posthumous book, Freedom and Civilization of 1947, there was a strong evolutionist tone to it. Culture change, his late theories of culture change and development had these ideas. But on the whole, it was now functionalism, and this was set against evolutionism. Malinowski's functionalism was the extreme form. Functionalism was absolutely anti-historical and anti-distributional, anti-diffusionist, anti-evolutionist. It treated in its extreme forms each culture as a closed system. It was very close to what later became in sociology systems theory. It's not totally distinct from developments in biology where you look at a closed ecological system. You look at some rock pools or the top of a mountain, and you look at the system of integration and the feedbacks and the loops and the different ways in which different parts of the system work together. Now, the new theoretical system was, as the older ones were, as we now look back on it, a worldview. It was a new way of organizing information, and as we've discovered with paradigm shifts, it wasn't achieved through the logical, rational, bit-by-bit destruction of previous theories, though there was a good deal of that, as I quoted with Robert Lowy. When you looked at the facts, the old facts seemed wrong. But it was a belief. It was much more than systematic destruction of an older theoretical system. It was, as Jarvie puts it, evolutionists were answering quite different questions to those Malinowski was interested in. But theirs were satisfactory answers to the questions they had posed themselves. Paradigms shift in the social sciences not by getting more data in answer to the same questions, but by changing the question. As the French put it, une question mal posée, Lefebvre puts it, a badly phrased question. That's what happens when you shift your ideas. You look at the world is the same, but you ask a different question and you find different answers. Both Jarvie and Gellner have stressed, as I pointed out before, that actually the new theories were not philosophically superior to the old theories. For example, Jarvie points out that Malinowski's positivist and relative views is bad metaphysics, particularly by denying the importance of the past and insisting on function. It prevents the study of social change. Both his positivist methodology and his egalitarian metaphysics prevent fruitful study of one of the major problems of the study of society, social change. Malinowski's theory cannot apply to social change. It didn't really provide us with a framework for studying history in any way, because if you concentrate entirely on a cross-section of time, that's fine. You learn all sorts of new interesting things. But why are things as they are? If you have an internalist view, they are as they are because they are as they are. It's circular, and there's no allowance for development. And this can be as inhibiting as the earlier evolutionism. You really can't understand anything without history, but it's equally important to understand how things work at a point in time. But his views, that is Malinowski's and the early functionist views, however unsatisfactory as we later discovered them to be, were immensely popular. There were whole schools of functionalism, and anthropology began to grow very fast in this period as an academic discipline. And they were immensely influential as a methodology of collection of data and they led to the collection of interesting data. So returning again to what I thought I was talking about, namely the reasons for all this, they are roughly what I've listed in earlier lectures. There are technological changes. I mentioned earlier the fact that sailing ships were a great weapon of anthropology, a great tool of anthropology, and of course sailing ships have given way to steamships, and hence people could travel and did travel more and more around the world. And there were the developments in technology that I mentioned before, the better guns, the better communications, the better power systems, the growth of the industrial might of different parts of the world. But the real difference, and the interesting difference for me, is that although this was all speeding on, the motor car and so on in Europe, and better communications, the gap, the political gap between Europe and America and the rest of the world was beginning to level out. And this is the change really, particularly in relation to anthropology, between empire, outward expansion, grabbing of much of the world by Britain and other European powers, and colonialism. The period between the First World War and the Second World War is holding on to what you've got already. The British Empire didn't expand much, if at all, during that period, but it didn't shrink much either. It was a period of stasis, of balance, of holding on. The great expansion of 1840 to 1890 was over. The 1890s and then the calamities of the First World War now seemed a steady state. In every one of the, this is from Hobsbawm's Industry and Empire, in every one of the four aspects of the economy we've just sketched, Britain fell behind her rivals, and thus, and this was all the more striking, not to say painful, when these occupied fields, which Britain had herself been the first to plough before abandoning them. In other words, this sudden transformation of the leading and most dynamic industrial system, economy, into the most sluggish and conservative in the short space of 30 or 40 years between 1860 and 1900 is the crucial question behind economic history. So there was a kind of shaking of the ideas of progress, partly because Europe was now getting more in balance and its belief in itself was shattered by the First World War. But even within Britain, Britain had until 1860 been entirely dominant, or largely dominant in Europe. It was the first industrial nation. After 1860, it began to be challenged. Germany first, France, and then America. And so the easy confidence of the Victorians, British Victorians, and in their empire and in their destiny, was no longer possible to maintain. This European expansion and political dominance argument is, I think, really central one. The open, widening, expanding, evolving world of the period of the great discoveries and the great empires was now over. The sense of this is very well caught, I think, in an interesting article by a man I've found most interesting, a geographer, H.J. Mackinder, in a paper he wrote to the Royal Geographical Society in 1904, appropriately entitled The Geographic Pivot of History. He says, when historians in the remote future come to look back on the group of centuries through which we are now passing and see them foreshortened, which we are now just able to do, it may well be that they will describe the last 400 years, that's up 1500 to 1900, as the Columbian epoch, and will say that it ended soon after the year 1900. Of late it has been a commonplace to speak of geographical exploration as nearly over, and it is recognised that geography must be diverted to the purpose of intense survey and philosophic synthesis. This is exactly what I've been arguing for anthropology. Now you do the intense survey and synthesize it. There has, he says, been virtually complete political appropriation of the world by European powers, but broadly speaking, we may contrast the Columbian epoch with the age which preceded it by describing its essential characteristics as the expansion of Europe against almost negligible resistances, whereas medieval Christendom was pent up in a rather narrow region and threatened by external barbarism. Exactly what I was saying before, that suddenly after about 1500 Europe began to gain confidence against its nearest neighbours even, namely Islam. Thus the cyclical view gave way to the serial, and the serial became more and more tipped up into the era of evolution, this is my words, as Europe gained political and technological dominance. But a new age was dawning at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, a new closing up. I quote, this is Mackinder, "From the present time forth, in the post-Columbian age, we shall again have to deal with a closed political system, and nonetheless that it will be one of worldwide scope. Every explosion of social force, instead of being dissipated in a surrounding circuit of unknown space and barbaric chaos, will be sharply re-echoed from the far side of the globe." In other words, if you look at it as a kind of like the sea, the sea of European dominance had risen right up to about 1890, and British dominance to about 1870-80, and then it begins to recede, ebb away. There were clearly signs of this before 1904 when Mackinder wrote. There had been rumblings of it, and a really serious challenge in the Indian Mutiny 50 years earlier. But around the beginning of the century, and even preceding the First World War, which was the final great shock, many people were beginning to be aware of this change. For example, Leonard Woolf in 1928 saw a similar break at exactly the same point in time. He argued that British imperialism in India, if it be successful in imposing Western rule and Western civilization upon Asiatic civilization, must introduce a violent ferment of reaction and carries the seeds of its own destruction. This was a shocking discovery in some ways. I mean, in some ways, the British Empire was founded on the idea that these territories and countries were gradually, or less gradually, absorbed as part of the imperial mission, and part of the mission was maybe to train these children up into self-ruled and self-government, but it was a long, long way away. Leonard Woolf, who was a great critic, as we've seen earlier, of imperialism, said actually, and it has a reflection of Mackinder's idea, the world is closed, and that if you send off force one way, it'll come back and hit you. Leonard Woolf is saying the same thing. When we invade and shock with our force other parts of the world, it'll come back on us and lead to the destruction of our ruling there. And he divides the history of the British imperial system into three periods: 1835 to the mutiny in 1858, and 1858 to 1905. He says the third period began in 1905 and still continues. It is a period of complete revolt against Europe. Influenced by the example of Japan, there is a rapid and violent development of Indian nationalism, and certainly Nirad Chowdhury's work and other work suggests that it's around the beginning of the 20th century that Indian nationalism and the idea that India should be free really becomes a much more widespread ideology. Then the World War, the First World War. The impact of the change in the tide on Europe was made more sudden and dramatic by the internal collapse of the Western world. There's a certain irony that the new relativist anthropology, as I mentioned, should be born as a consequence of this war in the work of Malinowski in the Trobriand Islands, imprisoned in the Trobriand Islands. And at this time, just as the hopes of European superiority are dashed, anthropology goes and looks for messages and understandings of our predicament in an intensive study of other worlds. Who could, after this debacle, slaughter of millions of people, believe in growing rationality, political stability, moral development, and so on, when the French, the Germans, the English were slaughtering each other? Any illusions that the world was anything other than a bloody competitive system, as Darwin to a certain extent had shown, withered. Thus you get a much more modest, ahistorical, structural attempt to make sense of the detail, a withdrawal from the destiny of Europe, and the engagement with micro-studies. From general mapping to intensive analysis, as Robert Lowy put it, who was one of the great founders and theoreticians of this. In the introductory chapter we saw that sound ethnology was impossible until geographical discovery had paved the way for at least a rough charting of the gamut of social variability. For some time past, exploration has taken a turn towards intensiveness of survey. There was other changes which went alongside this. The past, which in the height of the evolutionary period was seen as dark and backward and savage peoples and so on, was no longer seen like that. The rebirth of medievalism in the pre-Raphaelite movement in the later part of the 19th century was beginning to say we can learn a lot from the pre-Raphaelite, i.e. the medieval period. In the art of that period you see the restoration of belief in the beauty of earlier periods. And the nobility of the savage was now being hotly put forward. Primitive thought was not pre-logical, as Reverend Pritchard and many others were arguing. Primitive marriage was not communal and just a matter of horde instincts. Primitive family systems didn't evolve from the simple to the complex. Many of the earliest family systems were much more complex than ours. Primitive people were not irreligious and believers in ridiculous superstitions. The activities of simple societies, tribal societies, peasant societies were in their own terms consistent, moral, and worthy of respect. Primitive artifacts were beautiful. Henry Moore and his contemporaries began to see that we had dismissed a huge amount of very advanced craftsmanship and art in our arrogant way, and primitives were not lazy, they merely pursued social ends rather than just being obsessed with capitalist growth and accumulation. So ethnocentrism, taking our own ethnicity on our own ethnic culture as the centre of the world, was to be rejected, as was temporocentrism, to take our own age as the mark and measure of every other society. The mission of primitive man was to teach us some lessons and civilization. The tables were turned, and we should go out with some humility and learn about the variety, the richness, and the wonder of the world. Thank you.